in particular, I would want to speak to those who are fundamentalist, who are struggling to figure out how to handle raising their children according to their values, while also maintaining this loving, open, honest relationship with their children, right? Because that's a difficult line to straddle, right? Something that is really, really important to remember is that God is not as rigid as you think he is.
So I'd like to start off with, what do you think are some of the reasons that there are particular sects of Christianity, sections of Christianity that have really started to hold on tight and close down in the openness that Christianity really once had? Why do you think that's happening more and more?
Yeah, I think as it turns out, every branch of Christianity seems to have their fundamentalist sect and their more liberal sect, right? You think about, I used to call super traditional conservative Catholics Shiite Catholics, right? It's like Shiites, we kind of all have our own flavor, right? And so, I think here's the thing. We kind of go through phases, right? And I think society as a whole tends to do this. Like the pendulum tends to swing from conservative to liberal. We see it in the United States with our elections every 8 years, right? Like the pendulum tends to swing, and each generation tends to be one way or another way, depending upon what the last generation was. And why is that? I think it has a lot to do with the fact that there are positives and negatives to each side. Like there are positives to being more traditional and conservative and kind of this tried and true methodology. Things are black and white, things are really clear. We know what's right from wrong, right? But there are also negatives to that. And Trent Horn, who's a Catholic apologist, calls it the unnecessary burdens of fundamentalism. And that's really what it does. It places unnecessary burdens, creates separation where there doesn't need to be any separation, right? In these kind of more fundamentalist lines of thinking. Now, on the liberal side, there are lots of positives, right? To being more liberal, you feel more inclusive, it feels easier, right? It's more, it's kind of more all-encompassing, right? And there's a lot more variety in terms of different practices of worship and ways you can worship, right? If we're talking about it from a religious standpoint. But there are negatives, right? Where's the line? Where's the boundary, right? Where does it end? At what point is this a religion, or at what point is this just kind of like a social club that we attend sometimes, right? So that ambiguity, I think, is really hard for a lot of people. And so there's, the rest of us who are just kind of trying to toe the line, play the middle, right? And kind of embrace these aspects of loving everyone and being inclusive, and also, following some set of doctrine, right? Like believing that there is a religion after all, there is a moral code here, right? And that sometimes there really just is a right and a wrong way to do things. And so trying to walk that line. But it's ambiguous, right? Like it's hard, even as what I would consider a middle of the road Christian, probably more on the traditional and conservative side, but it's ambiguous. It's hard. Like, where do you draw the line? What are the rules, right? At what point do the burdens go from necessary to unnecessary, right? And that I think is hard. And humans don't like ambiguity, and humans also don't like hard things, right? Like thinking is hard, right? And really kind of diving deep into your own prejudices, into your own psyche. That's a hard thing to do. It's not fun. We prefer other people do that for us. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it.
Right. As a counselor, I can vouch for that. That tends to happen. Yes.
Yeah.
What should I do? I can't tell you. Right.
Yeah.
Well, as someone who grew up with a Southern Baptist mom and a Catholic dad, I grew up with all the Sunday school songs and lessons. And I vividly remember just the importance of Jesus loves everyone. God loves everyone, no matter what color their skin, no matter where they're from. And yet, as we get older, especially with social media, we find more and more segregation and more divisiveness. What are you noticing these trends are, especially in the last maybe 10 years, at 15, really, with the rise of not social media, but cell phones and connection and things? And where do you think Christianity has a fit in being able to still stay open and welcoming and loving, because that's what Jesus did. And he went and partied, in a sense, with those people, right? He went and celebrated with them, and also stay true to maybe some of the traditional feelings of, but where is that line?
Yeah. No, it's interesting because I feel like we as human beings, we are so tribal, right? And we figure out a way to draw our lines, our tribal lines. And, at one point in history, it was the color of your skin. At another point in history, it was were you, a Roman or not a Roman, right? Now it's interesting because I see this attempt. I think we live in such an amazing time in humanity, in particular in the Western world, right? Where, for the most part, we are an inclusive, open-minded meritocracy, right? For the most.
Mhm.
And we've worked really hard to get here. And it's taken a lot to get here. And so I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing people because this tribal nature is kind of no longer accepted.
Mhm.
Um, People are trying to distinguish themselves, right? People are still trying to separate themselves from others. Like you are not like me. We are not the same, right? And because it can't be now through things that are obvious, right? Like the color of our skin. Um, Now it's through ideology. And so, how can we create that tribality? How can we create that distinction between ourselves? Well, which one is like more traditional? Which way of living is the most correct, the most aligned, right? And so that's what we're seeing with these fundamentalist sects. They would call themselves, traditionalists, or more traditional Christians, is that they are creating these distinctions and these boundaries and these rules. I'm starting to see like the ideology, Katie, it is getting further and further out there to the point where recently on a podcast I was listening to with a guy who I think is a great guy, an intellectual, a great interviewer from Australia. Um, you know, he doesn't seem out there. But
Mhm.
on this podcast, he said, well, I could be convinced that uh, women don't need to vote and just the head of the family just votes, right? And like the head of the family just votes for the family. Let's play that out. Let's play that thought experiment out. What happens? Those who are married only get one vote, and those who are not married get two votes, right? So your candidate is now going to, like the more conservative, probably more family-oriented candidate is going to get half the votes. Are you kidding? That makes no sense, right? Because
Right.
these people are going to say, well, let's just not get married, right? Because they presumably don't value marriage as much, right? And so I'm just like, that makes absolutely no sense. It's really sad to me that we're getting to the point where we are so seeking this perfect holiness
Mhm.
that we are willing to entertain ideas that are so harmful to an entire population of women whose voices deserve to be heard. That is an egregious example, but I think it signifies how far fundamentalism is willing to go to
Mhm.
uh like to explore every potential um aspect of an ideology, even when it's obviously harmful. And I think that there's something wrong with that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I was just thinking as you first were sharing about, how now it's not so much our skin color and things like that because we are sort of mixtured and so multicultural. I
Mhm.
also think the fact that so many of us, like myself, we travel and we live abroad,
Yeah.
and it's a different thing to sing a song about it and then to live it, right? To actually live and be in communion and tribally, be involved with people who think differently than you, who feel differently than you, have different values, and be able to exist as yourself and respect them to exist as they are with different belief systems. And I think that's something that I've noticed in Christianity and specifically with fundamentalists, that that's a hard boundary to have, to hold respect for someone who thinks and feels differently, not calling them names, not, basically making them feel shame and guilt for being different. And I wonder if you could speak to just how shame and fear and guilt is starting to become a tool again, like it was a long time ago, to start to control those around them who think differently than they do.
I think shame and guilt have been used. I don't think it ever stopped. Like, I don't think shame and guilt are like coming back as tools. I think they have always been used as tools by both sides, right? Like we all know about the virtue signaling that's coming from kind of the more liberal side, and really like how far is that going to go, right? And then I think on
Mhm.
the other side as well, like the guilt and the shame regarding like you need to behave in this way and follow this strict set of moral codes, which may or may not be biblically based or based in anything
Right.
for that matter. Um, and if you don't, you're shunned, you're ostracized. And that ostracization, that's a tough word. Um, that really, it's the fear of being ostracized, it's the fear of being
Yeah.
kicked out of the group. To me, that's really the tool that has been used, I mean, for an eternity, right? Like
Yeah.
the fear of getting kicked out of the tribe, because the fact of the matter is that lone wolves don't exist in the human world. Like we need one another, for heaven's sakes, especially when we lived outside, right? Like
Right.
what would, in particular, if you're a woman, like what is a woman going to do, right? And so we really needed each other. Survival depended on the tribe. It depended on, following kind of the mores of the tribe. And yeah, I mean, for better or for worse.
I'd love for you to speak to, because you are in school right now and you're working on your doctorate in divinity, correct?
In theology, yeah.
In theology, actually. I have had friends walk similar paths in school, and on repeat, I have heard what they're teaching at the pulpit isn't the stuff fully that you get to learn, because you're diving into the Bible in such a way that a very small percentage of people get to do. And you're learning so much more of the history than what is taught. So, can you speak a little bit to what you're noticing, especially with the fundamentalist ways of teaching versus really what you're learning in school, and how they differ?
Yeah, there's a huge difference between what I'm learning in school and what's being taught at the pulpit. And, I think academia has a reputation for being, I mean, academia skews very liberal, even if you're studying theology. It skews very one way. I'm finding that it's incredibly one-sided. And so,
Mm.
so what myself and my classmates are actually doing is we're kind of pulling it a little bit back to center, back to a little bit more of that conservatism and that traditionalism. But you're right, what's being taught, even not just from the pulpit, but even like on YouTube and on these other places where people are seeking knowledge. And I bring up YouTube because I think social media really is where people seek knowledge, and YouTube being a search engine, this place for where long form content can exist in perpetuity. Right. That's where people go for knowledge, for apologetics, for spiritual enrichment. Right. And
Mhm.
what's really popular there are these hyper conservative, fundamentalist, traditional, the shock and awe, the more ridiculous and far reaching, the better. Right. And it's unfortunate because it's created this chasm between academia and kind of these, again, YouTube theologians, where I'm just really trying to bridge that gap, right? Because
Right.
academia is over here like kind of looking down their nose at the silly YouTube theologians who maybe don't know what they're talking about, or they're taking a fundamentalist reading of scripture, and they're like, well, we're doing the real work, like we actually know our sources and things. But it gets to a point where if you're not living in the real world, it just gets so esoteric. Like I was just having a conversation with one of my classmates on a book that we're reading, by a wonderful theologian who I've learned so much from, and I appreciate her perspective. But I'm like more than halfway through the book, and I don't even know if she believes in God. Like the way that she's talking about it, I'm like, she's just going so hard on the allegorical and rhetorical and metaphorical.
Mhm.
And I'm like, but what about the literal? Like, what's your literal belief here? Because I don't see that anywhere here. So we just get so, esoteric in academia.
Mhm.
And then I think, kind of the church militant is what kind of the laity is called, which has this very military name. And it's not meant to be necessarily. It's just we're the ones that we're not in heaven yet. We're fighting the good fight, right? But there are some people online who take church militant to its militant end, and they believe that this is a battle and it's a war and we're fighting this spiritual battle. And while in some ways that's probably true, that doesn't mean that we need to view everything through a lens of fear and through a lens of how is this evil, right? It's getting to the point where I think it's going to have to end. Like the pendulum has swung so far that at some point people are going to recognize that we are, like the church on social media is starting to act a little bit like the paranoid emperor, right?
Mm.
who sees danger lurking in every corner. And it's just like, yes, you know, it's important to be a good military leader, in particular if you're, you know, leading an empire, for example, but you have to
Mhm.
recognize when you're in a peacetime, right? And there's a difference between wartime leadership and peacetime leadership. And what I'm finding is that these YouTube theologians, in particular, kind of on the fundamentalist side, they're acting like we are in a constant state of war, even though the church, the Catholic Church, has actually probably never been more united than we are right now. You know, we have this gorgeous synod going on right now in Rome. All of our bishops are together talking about synodality and the universal church, and you know how we are going to approach the church and lead the church into the 21st century. And it's gorgeous. And you know, women's role in the church is being discussed. The church that's blossoming in Africa is being discussed. And, you know, I think oftentimes those of us here in the States or in the Western world, we forget to us, you know, this issue of whether or not women should become deacons, be allowed to become deacons. We're like, this is the most important issue, right? Whether you're on the liberal side or the conservative side. But actually, like the church in Africa is just trying to feed their people, right? Like maybe that's a little bit more important than, and that's what's beautiful about being the universal church. But I think we tend to put our blinders on a little bit too much.
Mhm. I'm glad you brought up a few times about the Western role and specifically the US. One of the things I'd love to hear your perspective on is I find often there is, and I wouldn't say it's just fundamentalist Christians, but there is a big group of Christians, and I say that with some quotations around it, who kind of approach Christianity like having the American flag beside them will mean when they die and go to heaven, an extra crown will be given, right? There's this pride in their country that they believe is intertwined with their faith.
Mm.
And I'd love to hear your thoughts if you experience that living in the States and because you are bicultural. In fact, actually, you are not bicultural, you're fully Hispanic.
I'm fully, yeah, I have fully
Yeah.
Lebanese in there, but
Yes. Well,
mostly his.
hello, right? So, how was that experience for you? Do you notice that? I'm just thinking, and maybe that's growing up in the Southeast, or I see that intertwined sort of feel of the flag and the church seem very intertwined. But do you find that you see that as well living in the States, that there's this inability to understand that it's maybe privileges of living in a certain country, but it doesn't mean more jewels, more, right? There's not more favor given because of where you live.
You know, I think that this is probably something that you are seeing because you are not living here.
Mhm.
Because, you know, as someone who lives here, I think what we're battling internally right now is I think the pendulum swung a little bit too far in the not proud to be an American direction. And I think it's actually swinging back into, okay, as much as we want to be supportive to other countries, we need to put our interests first. Like that's our government's job, right? And so, I think that there is a pendulum swing back to let's put Americans and their people first in terms, especially right now during an election, right?
Right.
On both sides.
Yeah.
Um, I think in particular on kind of this the conservative side, I can't tell if they believe that it makes them holier necessarily.
Mhm.
I do think that this idea of like God and country are very intertwined, and I think that that has been the case. I think that extends beyond just the United States of America. Like I think that was existent in Europe as well. Um, and you know, I don't know. I don't know if the reduction in religiosity in a population is correlated with a reduction in nationality in a population, right? Or a
That would
national,
be fascinating to look
right?
into.
That's a
Yeah.
great question. Yeah, because I mean, you don't see that as much in Europe, do you? This sense of
No, I mean, because I know what you're talking about historically and currently areas of Europe where, the pride in your country and religion can quite intertwine. But living in a country that got ransacked by doing that the wrong way, absolutely the wrong way, right? Now we're afraid to hang the flag here in Germany. It's, except for soccer, then it's free. Like free. We're allowed to do it with soccer, right? But
nationality.
it's like, don't show that pride. And very much so in Germany is the church suffering. There's churches closing around us. Many are leaving the church because here you are taxed. It's not that you tithe willingly, you are taxed every year. And so people will leave the church not to be taxed anymore. They're already taxed so much here in Germany. It's very high. There are many great things you get from that, but there's that piece where people are leaving the church and therefore really not attending, because then you can't get married in the church, you can't have a funeral in a church if you're not paying the taxes for the church. So it's a very interesting time here in Germany. I can't speak for all of Europe, but it's good to hear from you that, like, from your perspective, you see that the pendulum had swung the opposite way and is kind of finding a new middle. I think on the outside, even as an American Christian, it is like, oh, we really do think we're,
Yeah.
the hot stuff, right? Like, and because we're Christian, like even more so. But maybe it is that I see their faith first because you've got the t-shirts with the crosses on it and the scriptures and stuff, and then they're being the stereotypical American in Europe. And I'm like, oh, you're doing that thing that,
I
that
know.
they create, TikTok videos about. Please don't.
Something that I really love that JD Vance just said this on an interview with, I think it was Theo Vaughn. He said, Theo Vaughn asked him about his faith, and he said, I am religious, I am a man of faith, but he said, I don't like to wear it on my sleeve because I have a tendency to distrust people who wear it on their sleeve a little bit too much.
Mhm.
And I think that is a really good, I think that's a really good indication of what it looks like to be this sort of nationalist, proud of your country, conservative, uh, where your values and your actions speak louder
Mhm.
than your t-shirt.
Right. Or
And
the sticker on your car.
exactly, which I think is important. And I think probably because, you know, to the rest of the world, I'm sure that we look ridiculous, because so much of it is so performative, you know. But that's with any sort of anything that you, any ideology can appear to be this attempt at indoctrination, an attempt at tribality, an attempt at segregation, right? And I think in particular, one thing that the United States is not is we are not subtle, right? Like
No.
subtlety is not, and a lot of other nations are. And I would say, but I think myself being Latin American, we were the originals with the flag on the car, right? And so I'm like, I don't see that at all. What do you
You're like, this is normal.
they're actually a little too subtle. I'm like, if you don't have, three flags and, reggaeton bumping out of your car, then you're
Right.
doing
Like,
fine.
who are you?
Right. Where are you even from?
Yeah. I love that. Well, so to wrap us up a bit, I would love to hear, let's say you had a group of fundamentalists who were watching this or listening to it and really open to hearing your perspective. What message would you want to give them?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a beautiful question. Um, the message I would want to give them is that perfect fear, or excuse me, perfect love. I can't get this wrong. Perfect love casts out fear. And that's 1 John 4:18. Perfect love casts out fear. The opposite of love is not hate, it's fear.
Yeah.
The opposite of love is fear. And so I think, in particular, I would want to speak to those who are fundamentalist, who really are struggling to figure out how to handle raising their children according to their values, uh,
Mhm.
while also um, maintaining this loving, open, honest relationship with their children, right? Because that's a difficult line to straddle, right? And I think something that is really, really important to remember is that God is not as rigid as you think he is, right? Like one of my favorite stories, um, two of my favorite stories in the Bible are the two people that Jesus praised in the Gospels for their faith. So Jesus praised two people's faith in the Bible. Neither one of them were law-abiding Jews. They were both pagans. They weren't even monotheists. They weren't in the realm of following, Jesus's laws, right? They were pagans. One was the Roman Centurion, and another one was a woman who was also a pagan. And to the Roman Centurion, who said it was so humble, he had sent someone to ask Jesus to heal his daughter who was dying.
Mhm.
And again, this is a Roman who was kind of this military leader, again, a pagan. And the Jewish leaders said, you should do it because this guy is really good to us. Like he treats us well, right? And Jesus said, okay. So he starts walking to his house. So the runner goes back, says, Jesus is coming to heal the daughter. He sends the runner back, the Roman Centurion, and he says, no, you don't need to come all the way to my house, right? It's the word that we say during Mass. I'm not worthy that you should enter under my roof, right? That we say that, Catholics say that every Sunday at Mass. Those are the words of a pagan Roman centurion. Okay. He said, you don't have to come all the way here. I understand that you are busy. Just say the word and my daughter will be healed. I know that you have the power. You don't have to come here. Say the word. And Jesus said, never have I found such faith in Israel.
I got chills.
Chills. He was actually chastising the Jews around him. But he's telling them, in the tribe of Israel, among the chosen people, I have not seen this faith. And it was a pagan centurion, right? And so what does that show? That you don't actually have to be perfect to have a faith that is worthy of praise, right? And of course, that's not to say that, oh, you can just be whatever, do whatever, right? Of course, Jesus also said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, right? And so there's that piece too, right? So here we are again in the middle, right? Like, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, but never have I found such faith in Israel, right? And so where do we fall? But I think, again, being that this is a message for fundamentalists, just to say that, perfect love casts out fear. And I would just hope that you would approach God with love, not with fear, and just recognizing how deeply that you are loved. And in turn, hopefully that you treat others with that love, because that's how you will know. In the Gospels, it says, this is how they will know that you are my disciples, because you love one another.
That's huge. I feel like mic drop in that moment. I want to end us speaking to those who might be watching or listening, who are questioning or feel very, really oppressed in the group that they're a part of, to know that you don't have to completely walk away from your faith to face the boundaries that you might want to put up with family or friends, or the, as you mentioned, tribe that we've created, and to know you're not alone, that many have gone through the path that you're going through. And thank goodness for the online world today, because we can find those people out there to hear what they had to go through to step away from things that they felt oppression, and they felt like they couldn't even breathe in those groups. So don't feel like you have to step away from your faith, and know that there are people like Janelle and I out there who love to ask questions and better understand things. And that doesn't mean that we're turning away from anything that we believe in. It's us having curiosity to better know ourselves and God from a whole new perspective. So Janelle, thank you for this time. I just love what you're learning. I love your willingness to share it with people. And what I also love about you is that you love to continue to learn. And when you learn something new and better understand it differently, you present that as well. So it's never like, this is the gospel, this is hard truth, this is how it will always be. If you learn something different and change your perspective, you're willing to be open and share that as well. And I think that's so valuable in today's world.
Thank you, Katie. I so appreciate your time.